By the way, you guys should know that I am African American, not white. Just wanted to put that out there. I'm going to play another clip from blackagendareport.com with Glenn Ford, and I really love that picture right there. A little fish, the American fish, eating the world Vix Britannica empire.
Washington to isolate and strangle China, which was then only a few years away from becoming the world's largest economy. America's pivotal ally in the region was Saudi Arabia, the most reactionary regime on the face of the earth and a client state of the U.S. since the end of World War II. Instead of containing China, the Americans accelerated the processes of their own ruin, as I predicted on the very day they invaded Iraq. George Bush's successor, Barack Obama, called it a dumb war. But in fact, the Iraq War was a calculated act of desperate men, based on the inescapable facts of imperial decline and the logic of class survival. It was a war in which the potential damage to U.S. power and prestige in the world was weighed and measured against the consequences of allowing China to continue its rise, possibly in a future partnership with Russia, creating a new nexus of economic and political collaboration that would draw in Brazil, India, Latin America, and eventually even Europe. In other words, U.S. imperialism looked into the near future and saw its own death. It chose not to die, but to preemptively reset the global chessboard, knowing full well that failure in Iraq would hasten the pace of imperial decline. George Bush rolled the dice and lost. But that's what any ruling class would do when staring death in the face. Barack Obama, who answers to the same masters as Bush, entered office confronting the same scenario as his predecessor, only from an even weaker position. Obama chose to spread chaos through proxy jihadist wars in North Africa and the Middle East in partnership with Saudi Arabia. But the pace of imperial decline had quickened decisively with the financial meltdown. Chaos is an unreliable weapon, and jihadists are no friends of Wall Street bankers or Saudi royalty. China is acknowledged as the economic top dog, with Russia as a partner and the rest of the world reconfiguring itself. Death is still breathing down U.S. imperialism's neck. And so Barack Obama, like George Bush before him, rolls the dice of war. His partner, once again, is Saudi Arabia, without which the breathtaking plunge in oil prices could not have occurred. This time around, Washington aims to cripple Russia before moving against China by destabilizing the whole world's energy sector, including U.S. energy production. But that's like setting your apartment on fire to get rid of an unwanted roommate. There's no way to calibrate and control such an assault on energy pricing, no possible means of avoiding a cascade of unintended consequences to the world economy. If the war against Iraq was dumb, the oil price war is the mother of dementia and cannot help but further unravel all manner of capitalist structures, including deadly derivatives throughout the planet. But doomed systems and declining classes will do anything to forestall the inevitable. For Black Agenda Radio, I'm Glenn Ford. On the web, go to blackagendareport.com and sign up for email notifications of our new issues each Wednesday.
And I'll play this for you guys.
There's a potent and powerful racist and classist myth that tough cops, jailers, judges, and prosecutors are all that stand between us and rampant crime, anarchy, and ruin. For American politics, it's an increasingly necessary fantasy, a myth, that generations of public officials, from jailing judges and hang 'em high prosecutors to lock 'em up legislators, sheriffs, governors, and even presidents, have based their careers upon. The myths are necessary because no modern society can openly abandon its duty to provide its people quality educations, decent housing, living wage jobs, and economic security unless it is willing to brand large numbers of those to whom it won't provide education or housing or jobs and a dignified retirement unworthy, undeserving, and irredeemable. The American political class of both parties, including black politicians, stopped even talking about any rights to full employment, decent housing, and economic security and the like a generation ago, preferring to pretend that there is no alternative. Thus the myths of the trifling, lazy, drug-addled, crime-ridden, mostly black and brown poor are essential to the stability of America as we know it. These myths are the ethical and the moral justification of the neoliberal economic order and its prison state. Over-policing and mass incarceration don't just happen because the cops are racist, the prosecutors corrupt, and the legislators and media vicious and cowardly, nor because they're driven by the profits of private prisons or captive labor. America's savage police and prison states provide us with a long-running reality show that justifies our profoundly unequal and unjust social order. They give us a morality play that casts the criminalized and mostly non-white poor as villains, kept at bay by the heroism of that thin blue line, while schools, roads, parks, public works, nature, and even water are privatized, while private and public pensions are looted, while student loan debt, black unemployment, and underemployment continue to rise, and while wages continue to fall, while child homelessness is at an all-time high, and there are more vacant homes than homeless people, and while the rich and famous are celebrated and lionized for being famously rich. This is something that politicians from the president down to local mayors and aldermen know, and top cops from Homeland Security and the FBI to state and local departments know as well. It's something those in motion in the streets today over the last dozen and the next dozen police atrocities must better understand and articulate. The burgeoning movement against police immunity and impunity really is a threat to so-called national security, a menace to the privileges of banksters and employers, of privatizers and gentrifiers, the prerogatives of the 1%. When more of them openly question these prerogatives in the same breaths as they do the privilege of cops to murder and maim with immunity and impunity, we'll be a long step closer to a better world. For Black Agenda Radio, when you want to understand how the big wide world works, you don't look back at yourself and try to make it rhyme with what you think you already know. That means you do not ask smug, Eurocentric, self-congratulatory Bill Maher type questions like, why are they so touchy? How come those backward Muslims can't separate their religion from politics? If you actually want to understand why some fraction of Muslims saw gratuitous insult instead of satire when the French magazine Charlie Hebdo depicted the Prophet Muhammad doing things you would not want your own small children to see, or depicting pregnant Muslims as Boko Haram sex slaves howling for their welfare checks, all you've got to do is look at two bits of history. Philosopher Karen Armstrong, in her latest book, Religion and Political Violence, goes a long way to break it down. The first bit of history, Armstrong explains, is that the notion of religion as a set of practices and beliefs about the deity which you can perform on Sundays separate from how you put together political and economic life is an exclusively Western concept that nobody on earth before 17th and 18th century Europeans would recognize at all. The Sanskrit, Jewish, Arabic, and other Old World terms for religion all mean something that recognizes no separation between politics, economics, and morality and moral life. It took more than a century of warfare in the 16 and 1700s at a cost of hundreds of thousands of European lives in order to establish that kind of religion in Europe which could be separated from politics and economics. That way, European elites could have slavery and capitalism. European rulers could exterminate tens of millions in history's greatest genocide, colonizing the New World, and still call themselves Christians. Non-European Muslims are being allowed only a generation or two, and fortunately a lot less bloodshed, to make that kind of transition, which brings us to Armstrong's second bit of relevant history. She reminds us that the 20th century's so-called modernizers in the Muslim world mostly did not do it with friendly and democratic persuasion. Under the approving eyes of the West, they did it forcibly, with secret police, torture, discriminatory laws, kangaroo courts, and especially in Iran, sponsored by Britain and the U.S., with bullets fired into crowds of often nonviolent protesters. In addition to needed reforms, like curtailing Sharia law, Turkey's Kemal Ataturk, the Pahlavis in Iran, and Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser each locked up sometimes thousands of religion's opponents and purged them from the civil service and political life. This ain't exactly how you train people to engage in a friendly, respectful, and civil discussion of religious and political differences. It is how you make lasting enemies, enemies ready and alert for the next slight or insult. But this is the real and relevant history Americans have trained themselves not to know. Add to this the wave of armed U.S. and European interventions in Muslim lands, our puppet governments, our occupations, our torture campaigns and drone strikes, and factor in that even while cruise missile liberals like Bill Maher and U.S. presidents say we just don't do religious war, U.S. military personnel, at the tip of the spear as they say, call their enemies Hajis, and police departments in the U.S. and Europe surveil Muslim communities wholesale and incarcerate Muslims disproportionately. In this context, unlike jokes exposing the foibles of the powerful, which are real satire, Charlie Hebdo, which is now subsidized by the French government, is engaged in something much like war propaganda. And Bill Maher is just another cruise missile liberal, a bully. For Black Agenda Radio, I'm Bruce Dixon. Find us on the web each week at www.blackagendareport.com.
I want to play another clip. Globalism, Zionism, New World Order.
President Obama, a master of public relations, now has bragging rights for having granted clemency to a record number of federal prisoners, 1,176 of them at last count, more than those set free by the past 11 presidents combined. Looking at that number from a different angle, Obama released only one out of every 2,000 of the nation's 2.3 million prison inmates, the largest incarcerated population in the world, both in raw numbers and in the proportion of U.S. society that lives behind bars. In other words, Obama's clemencies, like all other presidents, are statistically meaningless and morally and politically distractive. But of course, that's what Obama's good at, distracting people. The incompetent, lazy, and white supremacist corporate media forget, or never reported, that for several years the Obama administration delayed the release from prison of 5 times as many inmates as he pardoned. About 6,000 federal prisoners convicted under the old crack cocaine laws. A federal appeals court wanted to let them out, ruling they were covered by a prison reform bill. But President Obama successfully argued to keep these men and women in prison. Several years later, Obama staged a huge public relations extravaganza, releasing many of these same inmates, supposedly out of the goodness of his heart. It was 2 years too late. Some never got out. The Brennan Center for Justice released a study last month that concluded the U.S. could set free 39% of its prison population with no threat to public safety. The Brennan researchers argue that you can't make a dent in the mass incarceration system unless whole categories of prisoners are made eligible for immediate release. They say 25% of the prison population should instead have been sentenced to drug treatment, community service, probation, or a fine. Another 14% of inmates have already served enough time in prison and are no longer a risk. Together, that comes to almost 40% of the prison population, 1.5 million people, about half of them black. Prison reformers seem to think that the system can be made more rational and fair. They don't seem to understand that the system is deliberately racist, brutal, arbitrary, and malevolent. It is not meant to be fair, and it cannot be reformed. Former Black Panther Sundiata Acoli turns 80 this month. He has been in a New Jersey prison since 1973 and first became eligible for parole in 1992, but was turned down by the parole board, which set his next parole hearing for 15 years from now, when Sundiata Acoli will be 95 years old. This system is pure meanness and race hate. The Brennan Center's proposal to release almost 40% of prison inmates is itself not even a halfway measure. As the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations points out in number 5 of its 19-point platform on Black self-determination, the United States would have to release 80% of its prison population, 4 out of every 5 inmates, just to bring the incarceration rate down to 1973 levels. And remember, the U.S. was already the worst mass incarceration state in the world back in 1973. Even the release of 4 out of every 5 inmates does not change the essential nature of American mass Black incarceration. There can be no compromise with such an evil. For Black Agenda Radio, I'm Glenn Ford. On the web, go to blackagendareport.com.
Just want to play that short clip for you guys.